The rhythmic pulse of the Fresnel lens sliced through the salt-laced air, a steady beam cutting the encroaching twilight. From his perch atop the lighthouse, Jack Griffin, a man etched by years of solitude and sea spray, surveyed his domain. The vast expanse of the Atlantic stretched before him, an endless azure canvas meeting a sky painted in hues of fading rose and deepening violet. For 20 years, this isolated sentinel had been his world, its lonely rhythm his only companion. Tonight, however, a jarring discord disrupted the familiar harmony. A glint of metal flashed far out on the horizon, catching the last rays of the setting sun. Jack adjusted his binoculars, his weathered hand steady despite a flicker of unease. It was a yacht, sleek and white, a stark contrast to the rough fishing trawlers that occasionally dotted these waters. Even at this distance, something seemed amiss. The yacht's movement was erratic, almost frantic. As the light faded further, the scene sharpened into horrifying clarity. A smaller, faster vessel, dark and low-slung, circled the yacht like a predator. Brief flashes of light, too quick to be lightning, sparked from the smaller boat. Then a figure, silhouetted against the white hull of the yacht, was hurled overboard. A crimson stain bloomed on the azure canvas, spreading slowly like a malevolent flower. Jack's breath hitched in his throat. He lowered the binoculars, his stomach clenching. Piracy? It seemed impossible, a relic of a bygone era. Yet, the brutal efficiency of the attack, the stark violence, left little room for other explanations. The smaller vessel, its grim purpose fulfilled, sped away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The yacht, now silent and drifting, seemed to settle deeper into the water. Jack knew the currents well. They would carry the vessel and the body further out to sea. He glanced towards the mainland, a faint glimmer of lights barely visible on the distant shore. Even if he could raise the alarm, it would be hours before any help could arrive. Too late for the man in the water. A fierce internal debate raged within Jack. The sea was a harsh mistress, and caution had been his constant companion. To venture out now in the failing light was a risk. Yet the image of that lone figure tossed into the unforgiving ocean burned in his mind. He thought of his own isolation, the countless times he had stared out at the vast expanse of water, feeling utterly alone. Could he, in good conscience, leave another human being to such a fate? With a sigh that held the weight of 2 decades of solitude, Jack made his decision. He descended the winding stairs of the lighthouse, the rhythmic clang of his boots echoing in the enclosed space. He quickly donned his oilskins, the familiar smell of salt and canvas a strange comfort. He grabbed a thick rope and a first-aid kit, his movements practiced and efficient. The small motorboat, bobbing gently in the sheltered cove below the lighthouse, was his lifeline to the world beyond. He started the engine, its throaty rumble a stark counterpoint to the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks. As he steered the boat out into the open water, the lighthouse beam swung behind him, a reassuring beacon in the encroaching darkness. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the faint, metallic tang of blood. Jack gripped the helm, his gaze fixed on the drifting yacht, a single thought echoing in his mind. Reach the man in the water, reach him before it was too late. The vastness of the ocean, usually a source of solace, now seemed menacing, a dark and indifferent expanse swallowing secrets and lives. The yacht's hull loomed large in the darkness, a ghostly silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Jack cut the engine and drifted closer, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the boat. He called out, his voice hoarse but received no reply. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the still figure floating near the stern. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack reached out, hauling the man aboard his small boat. The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow. His clothes, expensive and finely tailored, were soaked through, clinging to his lean frame. His face, pale and streaked with seawater, was marred by a deep gash on his forehead. Jack quickly assessed the injury, applying pressure to staunch the bleeding. The man groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. He looked at Jack, his eyes filled with confusion and pain. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice weak. "Jack Griffin," Jack replied, "lighthouse keeper. I saw what happened. I'm taking you back to the lighthouse." The man's gaze drifted towards the drifting yacht, a flicker of fear crossing his face. They tried to kill me," he whispered, his voice trembling. With a grunt of exertion, Jack helped the man into the boat. He started the engine, steering towards the distant glow of the lighthouse. The man shivered, his body racked with chills. Jack wrapped him in a spare blanket, trying to offer some comfort. Back at the lighthouse, Jack helped the man inside, settling him onto a cot in the small, Spartan living quarters. He cleaned and bandaged the wound on the man's forehead. As he worked, the man watched him, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now. "My name is Donovan Sterling." "Don't mention it," Jack replied gruffly. "You need to rest. I'll try to contact the authorities." Donovan managed a weak smile. "I appreciate that. I'm a businessman. I was sailing back to the mainland when those pirates attacked. They wanted everything. I barely escaped with my life." Jack nodded, the story confirming his initial suspicions. He busied himself with preparing a hot drink, his mind racing. Piracy in these waters was unheard of. It seemed almost targeted. He glanced at Donovan, who was watching him with an unnerving intensity. As the days turned into nights, Donovan slowly regained his strength. He regaled Jack with stories of his business ventures, his travels, his wealth. He spoke with an easy charm, a subtle charisma that disarmed Jack despite his initial reservations. He painted a picture of a powerful man wronged, a victim of circumstance. He subtly hinted at powerful enemies, rivals who would stop at nothing to destroy him. "They won't stop until I'm dead," Donovan confided one evening, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be looking for me. They might even come here." Jack, initially skeptical, found himself increasingly drawn into Donovan's narrative. The isolation of the lighthouse, the vastness of the ocean, amplified his sense of vulnerability. Donovan's words, like seeds of paranoia, took root in his mind. The radio, Jack's only link to the outside world, remained stubbornly silent. He had tried repeatedly to contact the mainland, but to no avail. Donovan, feigning concern, offered to help, tinkering with the wires and connections. After his intervention, the radio remained dead. Jack dismissed it as a technical fault, exacerbated by the storm that had raged the previous night. He didn't notice the almost imperceptible smile that flickered across Donovan's face as he stepped away from the lifeless device. Donovan's injuries, initially alarming, seemed to heal remarkably quickly. The deep gash on his forehead faded to a thin, barely noticeable scar. He moved with an increasing ease and confidence, a far cry from the weakened man Jack had rescued from the sea. He spent his days exploring the lighthouse, asking seemingly innocent questions about its operation, its layout, its access points. He studied the charts and maps that adorned Jack's small office, his gaze lingering on the intricate details of the surrounding coastline. Jack, caught in the web of Donovan's carefully crafted narrative, remained oblivious to the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the fleeting glimpses of a darker nature lurking beneath the surface. He was unknowingly playing the role of the shepherd, welcoming a serpent into his boat, unaware of the venomous bite that awaited him. The days bled into one another, marked only by the relentless sweep of the lighthouse beam and the changing tides. Donovan, seemingly recovered from his ordeal, became a fixture in Jack's solitary life. He was a captivating storyteller, weaving tales of exotic locales and high-stakes business deals. He spoke of rare artifacts, of fortunes won and lost, of ruthless competitors and treacherous alliances. Jack, starved for human interaction, found himself drawn into these narratives, a welcome distraction from the monotonous rhythm of his existence. Yet, a subtle unease began to gnaw at the edges of Jack's mind. Donovan's stories, though captivating, were often vague, lacking in concrete details. He mentioned names and places, but they seemed to shift and change with each retelling. He spoke of vast wealth, yet he carried no possessions save the soaked clothes he had been wearing when Jack pulled him from the sea. He claimed to be desperate to contact his associates, yet he seemed strangely unconcerned by the continued silence of the radio. The radio itself had become a source of growing frustration for Jack. Despite his repeated attempts, he could not raise a single signal. The static, once a familiar background hum, now seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of his isolation. He had checked the wiring, the connections, everything he could think of, but the device remained stubbornly lifeless. He suspected the storm, with its violent winds and driving rain, had somehow damaged the internal components. One evening, as the wind howled around the lighthouse, whipping the waves into a frenzy, Jack decided to make one last attempt. He climbed the winding stairs to the small room housing the radio equipment, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He checked the connections once more, adjusting the dials with a practiced hand. Still nothing. Just the relentless hiss of static. He slumped back against the wall, a wave of despair washing over him. He felt utterly alone, cut off from the world, trapped in this isolated tower with a man whose story was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. As he descended the stairs, he saw Donovan standing by the window, gazing out at the turbulent sea. The flickering lamplight cast his face in shadow, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the intensity of his gaze. "Still no luck?" Donovan asked, his voice soft. Jack shook his head, a sigh escaping his lips. "Nothing. It's like the whole world has gone silent." Donovan turned towards him, a strange expression on his face. It was a fleeting look, a mixture of amusement and something else, something that Jack couldn't quite decipher. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of his own growing unease. "Perhaps it's for the best," Donovan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps it's safer this way. They wouldn't be able to find us here." Jack looked at him, a flicker of suspicion igniting in his mind. "Who wouldn't be able to find us?" he asked, his voice tight. Donovan hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the window once more. "My associates," he replied, his voice evasive. "The ones who attacked me. They're dangerous men, Jack. Ruthless. They won't stop until they get what they want." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the lighthouse. Donovan's words, though vague, carried a chilling weight. He thought of the yacht, the brutal efficiency of the attack, the crimson stain spreading across the azure canvas. He thought of the radio, stubbornly silent, cutting him off from any hope of rescue. He thought of Donovan, the charming stranger he had rescued from the sea, whose story was beginning to unravel like a frayed rope. The wind howled outside, carrying whispers on the wind, whispers of danger and deceit. Jack felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest, a premonition that the solitude he had cherished for so long was about to be shattered in a way he could never have imagined. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, the turbulent sea mirroring the growing unease in Jack's heart. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence hanging over the lighthouse. He stood by the window, sipping his lukewarm coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The vast expanse of water, usually a source of solace, now seemed menacing, a curtain concealing unknown dangers. Donovan was still asleep, his breathing slow and even. Jack studied him, trying to reconcile the charming, sophisticated businessman with the fleeting glimpses of a darker nature he had witnessed the previous night. He thought of the radio, still stubbornly silent, and the vague threats Donovan had uttered about ruthless enemies. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that he had stumbled into a situation far more complex and dangerous than he had initially realized. As he turned away from the window, his eye caught a flicker of movement on the horizon. He squinted, adjusting his gaze. 3 ships, their dark hulls barely visible against the gray sky, were slowly emerging from the mist. They were sailing in formation, their sails billowing in the light breeze, heading directly towards the lighthouse. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Jack's veins. Were these the authorities, finally responding to his silent pleas for help? Or were they the associates Donovan had spoken of, the ruthless men who would stop at nothing to find him? He grabbed his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly, and focused on the approaching vessels. As they drew closer, the details became chillingly clear. These were not rescue ships. They were something far more sinister. Their hulls were low and sleek, designed for speed and maneuverability. They bristled with cannons, their dark muzzles pointing menacingly towards the shore. Black flags, emblazoned with skulls and crossbones, flapped in the wind. These were pirate ships. Jack's breath hitched in his throat. He lowered the binoculars, his mind reeling. Piracy. It wasn't just a story Donovan had concocted. It was real. And he, Jack Griffin, the solitary lighthouse keeper, was caught in the middle of it. He turned to wake Donovan, his voice hoarse with urgency. "There are ships approaching," he said, his voice shaking. 3 of them. They look like pirate ships. Donovan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He sat up, his gaze sharp and alert. "My rescuers," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They've finally come for me." Jack stared at him, his mind struggling to process the information. Rescuers? These heavily armed vessels, bristling with cannons and flying the black flag of piracy, were Donovan's rescuers? It didn't make sense. Unless... A sudden, horrifying realization dawned on Jack. He looked at Donovan, his eyes widening with understanding. The expensive clothes, the vague stories, the sudden healing, the silent radio, the carefully planted seeds of paranoia. It all clicked into place. Donovan hadn't been rescued. He had orchestrated the entire thing. He was one of them. A pirate. He watched as Donovan rose from the cot, his movements fluid and confident, no trace of the injured man he had pretended to be. He walked to the window, his gaze fixed on the approaching ships. He raised his hand, a subtle gesture, and a flicker of light flashed from one of the vessels, a silent acknowledgement. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and anger surging through him. He had been a fool, blinded by compassion, manipulated by a cunning and ruthless criminal. He had welcomed a wolf in sheep's clothing, and now he was trapped in his own lighthouse, a prisoner of his own kindness. As the ships drew closer, Jack noticed something else, something that sent a fresh wave of fear through him. He could see figures moving on the decks, their movements purposeful and efficient. They were armed, carrying swords and pistols, their faces grim and determined, and they were looking directly at the lighthouse, at him. He glanced at Donovan, who was still watching the approaching ships, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. He saw a glint of metal beneath the sleeve of his shirt, a tattoo, a skull and crossbones, the same symbol that adorned the flags of the pirate ships. There was no doubt now. Donovan Sterling was not a victim. He was a predator. The ships dropped anchor a short distance from the shore, their black hulls casting long shadows over the water. Small boats were lowered, filled with armed men, their faces obscured by bandanas and scarves. They rowed towards the lighthouse, their oars dipping rhythmically into the water, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. Jack felt a cold dread settle over him. He was trapped, alone with a pirate lord and his crew closing in. He had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that could cost him everything. He had offered sanctuary to a serpent, and now he was about to pay the price. Donovan turned from the window, the smile gone, replaced by a cold, hard glint in his eyes. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the intricate tattoo Jack had glimpsed earlier, a skull entwined with a serpent, rendered in vivid blues and greens against his tanned skin. "You see, Jack," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I haven't been entirely truthful with you." Jack remained silent, his gaze fixed on the tattoo, a symbol of the danger he now faced. He backed away slowly, his mind racing, searching for a way out, a way to escape the trap he had unwittingly walked into. The attack on the yacht, it was staged, Donovan continued, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. A necessary diversion. I needed to disappear for a while to evade certain authorities. And you, my dear Jack, were my unwitting ticket to freedom. He stepped closer, his eyes boring into Jack's. Your rescue, your kindness, your isolation, it was all too perfect. A secluded lighthouse, a naive keeper, a perfect hiding place until my associates could retrieve me. Jack felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at being so thoroughly deceived. You used me, he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Donovan shrugged, a dismissive gesture. Let's just say I capitalized on an opportunity. You see, Jack, the world is a game and only the clever survive. You were a pawn in my game, a necessary sacrifice. The sound of boots on the metal stairs outside broke the tense silence. The pirates had arrived. The heavy door swung open, revealing half a dozen men, their faces masked, their eyes glinting with menace. They carried swords and pistols, their movements swift and practiced. They fanned out, surrounding Jack, cutting off any avenue of escape. Donovan gestured towards the men, a smug smile playing on his lips. My crew, he said, his voice dripping with pride. They're not exactly known for their gentle manners. So I suggest you cooperate for your own sake. He turned his attention to one of the pirates, a hulking brute with a scarred face and a vicious sneer. Secure the lighthouse, he ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative. Make sure no one interferes with our departure. The pirates moved quickly, their boots clanging on the metal stairs as they spread throughout the lighthouse, securing the entrances and exits. Jack felt a sense of despair wash over him. He was trapped, surrounded by ruthless criminals with no hope of escape. Donovan turned back to Jack, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Now, Jack, he said, his voice smooth and condescending, I believe you have something I need. He gestured towards the small office where Jack kept his charts and maps. The charts. The ones detailing the hidden passages through the reefs. Jack understood instantly. Donovan wasn't just hiding from the authorities. He was smuggling something valuable enough to risk piracy and murder. And he needed Jack's local knowledge to navigate the treacherous waters surrounding the lighthouse. He hesitated, his mind racing. Could he stall for time? Could he find a way to signal for help? He glanced at the pirates, their faces hard and unforgiving. He knew that any attempt at resistance would be met with swift and brutal retribution. The charts, Donovan repeated, his voice edged with impatience. Don't make me ask again. Jack, defeated and resigned, led Donovan to the office. He opened the drawer where he kept the charts, his hands trembling slightly. He spread them out on the desk, his gaze lingering on the intricate details of the coastline, the hidden coves and treacherous reefs that he knew so well. Donovan studied the charts, his finger tracing the lines and symbols, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Excellent," he said, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. "This is exactly what I need." He rolled up the charts, tucking them under his arm. He turned to Jack, his expression hardening once more. "You've been helpful, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But your usefulness has come to an end." He gestured towards the pirates, a silent command. Two of the men stepped forward, their hands gripping the hilts of their swords. Jack closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. He had offered kindness, and he was about to pay the ultimate price. He had been a prisoner of his own compassion, trapped in a web of deceit, a pawn in a game he never knew he was playing. Jack braced himself, the cold steel of the pirate's blade pressing against his throat a stark reminder of his predicament. He opened his eyes, meeting Donovan's gaze. The pirate lord's expression was a chilling blend of amusement and ruthlessness. "Any last words, Jack?" he asked, his voice laced with mock concern. Jack swallowed, his throat dry. He knew pleading would be futile. Donovan had revealed his true nature, a predator who saw him as nothing more than a disposable pawn. Yet, a flicker of defiance ignited within him. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing him broken. "You won't get away with this," Jack said, his voice surprisingly steady. "The authorities will find you." Donovan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The authorities?" he scoffed. "They'll find you, Jack, surrounded by pirates, with stolen charts in your possession. They'll assume you were in on it from the beginning. You'll be their scapegoat, their convenient explanation. And I'll be long gone." He gestured towards the window, where the pirate ships bobbed gently on the waves, ready to sail. "My fleet awaits. We have places to be, treasures to acquire. You, on the other hand, will have plenty of time to reflect on your misplaced kindness." He nodded to the pirates holding Jack. "Take him outside," he ordered. "Let him watch us sail away. A parting gift of sorts." The pirates dragged Jack towards the door, their grip tight and unforgiving. As they reached the top of the stairs, Jack caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. A small, handheld mirror, lying on a shelf near the entrance to the lamp room. An idea, desperate and audacious, sparked in his mind. He stumbled, feigning weakness, his body slumping against the railing. The pirates, caught off guard, loosened their grip momentarily. In that fleeting instant, Jack lunged towards the shelf, grabbing the mirror. He held it up, angling it towards the distant mainland, catching the rays of the rising sun. He began flashing the mirror, sending a series of quick, sharp reflections towards the shore. He knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble. The distance was vast, the chances of anyone seeing his signal slim. But it was his only hope. The pirates reacted instantly, realizing what he was doing. They lunged towards him, their curses echoing in the enclosed space of the lighthouse. Jack continued flashing the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest, his movements frantic and desperate. He had to get the message through. He had to let someone know what was happening. One of the pirates grabbed his arm, wrenching the mirror from his grasp. He threw it to the ground, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Jack felt a surge of despair, his last hope extinguished. Donovan appeared at the top of the stairs, his face contorted with rage. "You fool," he roared. "Did you really think you could outsmart me? Did you really think you could escape?" He descended the stairs, his eyes blazing with fury. He grabbed Jack by the collar, lifting him off his feet. "You sealed your own fate, Jack," he hissed, his voice venomous. "You had a chance to cooperate, to walk away from this, but you chose to play the hero. And now you'll pay the price." He threw Jack to the ground, his body slamming against the metal floor. He gestured to the pirates, his voice cold and hard. "Take him to the boat," he ordered. "We'll deal with him later." The pirates dragged Jack outside, the cold morning air stinging his face. He could see the pirate ships waiting, their sails billowing in the breeze, ready to carry Donovan and his stolen treasures away. He looked towards the mainland, a faint sliver of land barely visible on the horizon. He had failed. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and ultimately betrayed. As they shoved him into the small boat, Jack noticed something on the distant shore, a flicker of movement, a glint of light. He squinted, his heart pounding with a renewed surge of hope. It was a ship, a large vessel, its white hull gleaming in the morning sun. And it was heading directly towards the lighthouse, its speed increasing with every passing moment. Could it be? Could his desperate gamble have paid off? The small boat pitched and rolled in the choppy waters, the rhythmic splash of the oars a stark counterpoint to the pounding in Jack's chest. He sat hunched in the stern, his hands bound tightly behind his back, his gaze fixed on the approaching ship. It was definitely a government vessel, its crisp white hull and distinctive markings unmistakable. Hope, a fragile flicker in the darkness of his despair, began to burn a little brighter. Had someone seen his frantic signaling with the mirror? Had the authorities somehow been alerted to Donovan's presence? Donovan, standing in the bow of the boat, seemed oblivious to Jack's renewed hope. His attention was focused on the lead pirate ship, where he was issuing a series of sharp commands. The other two pirate vessels had already begun to maneuver, positioning themselves to form a protective cordon around Donovan's escape route. Faster! Donovan barked at the men rowing, his voice edged with impatience. We don't have much time. Jack watched as the government vessel continued to close in, its wake churning the water into a white froth. He could make out figures on the deck, their movements purposeful and urgent. They were armed, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. This was it, his chance. He had to find a way to alert them to Donovan's presence, to expose his deception. He shifted his weight, trying to attract Donovan's attention. They're coming for you, Sterling, he said, his voice loud and clear. You won't get away with this. Donovan turned, his eyes flashing with anger. Silence, he hissed. One more word out of you and I'll throw you overboard myself. He turned back to the pirate ship, his attention focused on their escape. The lead vessel had begun to move, charting a course through the treacherous reefs that surrounded the lighthouse. Jack knew these waters intimately, their hidden dangers and unpredictable currents. He also knew that Donovan, despite his bravado, was relying on Jack's local knowledge to navigate this perilous passage. You need me, Jack said, his voice low but firm. You'll never make it through the reefs without my guidance. Donovan hesitated, his gaze flickering back to Jack. He knew Jack was right. The charts he had stolen were detailed, but they couldn't replace years of experience navigating these treacherous waters. He needed Jack at least for a little while longer. Very well, Donovan said, his voice grudging. Untie him. One of the pirates cut Jack's bonds, his movements rough and impatient. Jack rubbed his wrists, trying to restore circulation to his numb hands. He looked at Donovan, his eyes meeting the pirate lord's gaze. I'll guide you through the reefs, he said, his voice steady. But only if you promise to let me go once we're clear. Donovan smiled, a cruel, mocking expression. Promises, he said. We'll see how valuable your guidance proves to be. He gestured towards the lead pirate ship, signaling for it to slow down. Lead the way, Jack, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Show us your expertise. Jack stood up, his legs unsteady after hours of being bound. He took his place in the bow of the small boat, his gaze fixed on the treacherous waters ahead. He knew this was a dangerous gamble. He was playing a game of wits with a ruthless criminal, his life hanging in the balance. But he had no other choice. He had to find a way to survive, to expose Donovan's crimes, to bring him to justice. As the small boat followed the lead pirate ship through the maze of reefs, Jack carefully guided them, pointing out the hidden dangers, the shallows, the treacherous currents. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, his voice betraying no hint of the fear that gnawed at his insides. He watched as the government vessel continued to gain on them, its presence a constant reminder of the stakes. He knew he had to act soon before it was too late. He had to find a way to alert the authorities to Donovan's presence, to expose his deception. As they navigated a particularly narrow passage between two jagged reefs, Jack saw his opportunity. He leaned forward, pretending to lose his balance, his hand reaching out as if to steady himself. In one swift movement he grabbed Donovan's arm, yanking him off balance. Donovan stumbled, his body crashing against the side of the boat. What are you doing? He roared, his face contorted with rage. Saving my own life, Jack replied, his voice grim. He pushed Donovan towards the side of the boat, his body slamming against the railing. He pointed towards the approaching government vessel, his voice loud and clear. He's a pirate, he shouted. He staged the attack on his yacht. He's smuggling stolen goods. Donovan struggled to regain his balance, his eyes blazing with fury. He lunged towards Jack, his hands reaching for his throat. But it was too late. The government vessel was almost upon them. A loud hailer blared, its voice echoing across the water. Stop. This is the Coast Guard. Surrender immediately. The pirates on the other boats hesitated, their movements uncertain. They looked at Donovan, their faces filled with confusion and fear. Donovan, realizing his game was up, his escape thwarted, let out a roar of frustration. He turned to Jack, his eyes filled with venomous hatred. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, his voice barely audible above the roar of the approaching vessel. But it was too late. The Coast Guard vessel had pulled alongside the small boat. Armed officers swarmed aboard, their weapons trained on Donovan and his crew. They quickly subdued the pirates, their resistance futile against the overwhelming force. Jack watched as Donovan was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of anger and defeat. He had been outsmarted, his elaborate scheme foiled by the very man he had manipulated and betrayed. As the Coast Guard officers secured the pirate ships and began the process of arresting the crew, one of the officers approached Jack. "You're Jack Griffin, the lighthouse keeper?" he asked. Jack nodded, his body still trembling from the ordeal. "We received a signal, a series of flashes from a mirror," the officer continued. "It led us right to you." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. His desperate gamble had paid off. His signal, though faint and fleeting, had been seen. He had survived. He had not only saved his own life but had also brought a dangerous criminal to justice. He looked towards the mainland, the familiar silhouette of the lighthouse rising against the morning sky. He had returned from the brink, from a devil's bargain that had almost cost him everything. He had faced the darkness, and he had emerged victorious. The Coast Guard cutter, a stark white behemoth against the steel-gray sea, dwarfed Jack's small boat. Officers, crisp in their dark uniforms, swarmed over the captured pirate vessels, efficiently securing the surprised crews. The morning air, thick with the smell of salt and the lingering tang of gunpowder, vibrated with the shouts of commands and the clatter of weapons. Jack, still trembling from the adrenaline that had surged through him during the confrontation, watched from the deck of the cutter, a blanket draped around his shoulders. A young officer, his face grim despite the successful operation, approached Jack. "Mr. Griffin," he said, his voice respectful, "we need to ask you a few questions." Jack nodded, still slightly dazed. He recounted the events of the past few days, the attack he had witnessed, his rescue of Donovan, the slow unraveling of the pirate lord's deception. He described the stolen charts, the treacherous passage through the reefs, his desperate gamble to alert the authorities. The officer listened intently, taking notes, his expression growing increasingly grave. As Jack finished his story, the officer's gaze shifted towards the captured pirate ships. "Mr. Griffin," he said, his voice low and serious, "those ships, they weren't guarding your escape. They were guarding Donovan Sterling's." Jack frowned, confused. Guarding his escape? But why? The officer sighed, his expression grim. "We've been tracking Donovan Sterling for months. He's not just a pirate, Mr. Griffin. He's a notorious smuggler, specializing in high-value artifacts stolen from museums and private collections across Europe. We believe the yacht incident was a staged diversion, a way to throw us off his trail while he transported his latest acquisition." He gestured towards the captured pirate ships, their holds now being searched by the Coast Guard. "We suspect those ships are carrying millions of dollars worth of stolen artifacts. Sterling was using you, Mr. Griffin, as an unwitting shield. He knew we wouldn't risk engaging his fleet in a direct confrontation near the lighthouse. He was counting on your local knowledge to navigate the reefs, to give him a clear passage while we were held at bay." Jack stared at the officer, his mind reeling. He had been a pawn in a far more elaborate game than he could have ever imagined. His act of kindness, his attempt to rescue a fellow human being, had been twisted and manipulated, used to facilitate a massive criminal operation. The isolation he had cherished for so long, the very thing that had drawn him to the life of a lighthouse keeper, had become his vulnerability, his undoing. "But, the attack on the yacht," Jack stammered, his voice filled with disbelief. "The man thrown overboard," the officer's expression softened. "It was a ruse, Mr. Griffin. A staged performance. The man thrown overboard was likely one of Sterling's own crew, perhaps someone he no longer needed, someone he could sacrifice to maintain his charade." Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had been so completely deceived, so thoroughly manipulated. He had risked his life, his freedom, for a man who had seen him as nothing more than a disposable tool. He watched as crates, filled with priceless artifacts, were hauled up from the holds of the pirate ships. Ancient statues, glittering jewels, priceless paintings, all stolen, all smuggled under his unwitting protection. The scale of the operation, the sheer audacity of Donovan Sterling's plan, left him speechless. "Mr. Griffin," the officer said, his voice gentle, "I'm afraid we have to take you into custody." Jack looked at him, his eyes widening with alarm. Custody? But I'm innocent. I was tricked. I didn't know anything about this. The officer sighed, his expression sympathetic. I understand, Mr. Griffin. But from our perspective, it looks like you were complicit in Sterling's escape. You provided him with sanctuary, you gave him access to the charts, you guided him through the reefs. We need to investigate further to determine the extent of your involvement. Jack felt a cold dread settle over him. He had been a victim, a pawn in a criminal's game, and now he was being treated like a criminal himself. He had risked everything to do what he believed was right, and now he was facing the consequences of another man's actions. He was escorted back to the mainland not as a hero but as a suspect. He watched as the pirate ships, now under Coast Guard control, were towed towards the harbor, their black flags flapping in the wind, a stark reminder of the deception and betrayal he had endured. The authorities questioned him relentlessly, probing for inconsistencies in his story, searching for any evidence of his complicity. He protested his innocence, explaining his naivete, his misplaced trust, his desperate attempts to alert them to Donovan's true nature. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The evidence, circumstantial though it was, pointed against him. He had been found with a notorious pirate, in possession of stolen charts, guiding a fleet of pirate ships through treacherous waters. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Jack remained in custody, his life in limbo, his reputation tarnished, his future uncertain. He became a pariah, a symbol of misplaced trust, a cautionary tale whispered among the maritime community. The lighthouse, once his sanctuary, his refuge from the world, now stood empty, a silent testament to his downfall. Donovan Sterling, meanwhile, had disappeared. Despite the capture of his ships and the recovery of the stolen artifacts, the pirate lord himself had managed to evade capture. He had vanished into the vastness of the ocean, a ghost on the horizon, leaving Jack Griffin to face the consequences of his actions. The price of mercy, Jack realized, could be a heavy one. He had paid it in full, sacrificing his freedom, his reputation, his very life for a man who had preyed on his kindness, his compassion, his humanity. He had learned a harsh lesson, a lesson etched in the salt spray and the cold steel of betrayal. In the vast and unforgiving world of the deep sea, even the noblest of intentions could lead to the darkest of consequences.